Welcome to the night the Atlantic stopped breathing. March 1943. Somewhere between Greenland and the British Isles, the sea turned blacker than oil, blacker than fear itself. A convoy of Liberty ships drifted through the fog lights off engines humming low, every man on deck, listening for a sound he hoped never to hear. And then, it came. The long metallic echo of a torpedo strike, one heartbeat, one flash, and another ship vanished into the dark. Hitler believed this was how Britain would die. Not by invasion, not by bombs, but by hunger, one sunken cargo at a time. He called it the tonnage war, to choke the island, to cut every artery that fed it. And for a moment, it almost worked. The U-boats hunted in packs, the gray wolves of the deep circling convoys, like sharks around wounded prey. Every man aboard knew the odds 1 in 5 ships wouldn't make it home. But what no one told them was that salvation was already being built far from the sea. In shipyards from California to Maine, sparks rained down, steel plates clanged, and men shouted over the roar of creation. They were building lifelines, 2,710 of them, a fleet so vast it would outbuild death itself. Each one plane, welded fast, meant to survive only a single voyage, yet together they would change the war. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The coastlines that once waited for bread, the cities that forged the steel, or maybe somewhere inland, far from the roar of the waves, but still touched by their echo. Because this isn't just a story of ships, it's a story of defiance of a world that refused to sink. Welcome to WW2. Hitler thought he could starve Britain, but 2,710 Liberty ships kept the Lifeline alive. June 1940. The air above the Channel was thick with the smoke of retreat. The beaches of Dunkirk were still smoldering, littered with helmets, rifles, and the ghosts of a broken army. France to Saddam had fallen, and her tricolor lowered her people under occupation, her ports now bearing the black crosses of the Kriegsmarine. Across the water, Britain stood alone, a small island staring into the mouth of a vast empire of conquest. The sun hadn't set on the British Empire yet, but it was flickering. And somewhere in Berlin, Adolf Hitler smiled. He no longer needed to invade, not yet. He had found a weapon far more patient than bullets. Starvation. The ocean would be his ally. He called it the tonnage war, the war of numbers, of ton after ton of British shipping, sinking to the bottom until the island's lungs gave out. Britain imported nearly everything: food, fuel, munitions, steel, rubber. It was a nation that lived by its lifelines, and Hitler intended to sever every one of them. If he could choke the Atlantic, he believed he could strangle Britain into surrender without ever firing another shot on London. By the autumn of 1940, the first packs of U-boats began their silent work. They left their pens in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Under the veil of night, narrow, sleek, painted the color of death. The German crews were young 20-year-olds trained to kill without being seen. They called themselves Die Grauen Wölfe, the Grey Wolves. Their mission to turn the Atlantic into a hunting ground. The early results were terrifying. 1 ship, 2, then 20. Tankers, freighters, trawlers, none safe, none armed enough to fight back. Each sunrise brought new telegrams of loss. SS Clan Fraser missing. SS Beaverburn presumed lost. SS Empire Star sunk with all hands. The newspapers stopped printing every name. There were too many. Oil slicks washed up on the Irish coast. Lifeboats drifted empty, their paint burned away by salt and sun. And somewhere in London, in a dark war room beneath the streets, Winston Churchill studied the reports. The Battle of the Atlantic, he wrote in his diary, is the dominating factor throughout the war. Everything turns on it. He knew the truth that the war in Europe would not be won on the fields of France or the skies of Britain, but in the cold, invisible corridors of the North Atlantic. The Lifeline had to hold, but it was failing. By early 1941, Britain was losing ships faster than she could build them. Imports dropped by half. Food shortages spread. Tea and sugar were rationed. Families queued for bread, for coal, for light. At night, the sirens wailed as bombs fell over London, but beneath those bombs was a deeper terror that no ship would arrive tomorrow. The Blitz could break walls, but the blockade could break the soul. Hitler called his U-boats his steel sharks, and in those first years they were feeding well. In ports like Liverpool, Glasgow, and Cardiff, dock workers stood silently as convoys were announced, code-named HXSC on, letters that meant little but carried life and death. Sailors of the merchant navy climbed the gangways of their ships, knowing that 1 in 5 would not return. Civilians, not soldiers, facing the deadliest weapon of the war. They called the middle stretch of the Atlantic, the Gap, a place too far for air cover, too dark for rescue, too wide for hope. When a ship entered the Gap, it was as if it had vanished into another world. A survivor of one torpedoed freighter wrote later, "You don't see them. You feel them. The sea goes quiet. Even the gulls disappear. And then the water moves, like something breathing underneath you." He spent 3 days on a raft before being found. Most weren't so lucky. By the end of that winter, over 2 million tons of Allied shipping lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. The sea had become a graveyard, and Britain's lifeline was bleeding out. Yet even as the waters turned red and black hope began to take shape, thousands of miles away, in the clang of steel and the hiss of welding torches. Across America, shipyards in Virginia, California, Oregon. Maine, once quiet, began to roar with motion. Men worked 16-hour shifts. Women for the first time took up torches and rivet guns. The smell of oil and smoke filled the air as the first hulls took form. They weren't elegant. They weren't fast. They were ugly, blocky, angular, rushed. But they could float. And most importantly, they could be built in weeks instead of months. They would call them Liberty ships. In Washington, a man named Henry J. Kaiser stood before the Maritime Commission and promised a miracle. He said, America could outbuild death itself. If they sink them, he declared, we'll build them faster than they can sink. It sounded insane, yet so did everything else about this war. And so began the great industrial race, steel versus torpedoes, factories versus submarines, rivets versus periscopes. It would decide not just the fate of Britain, but of the free world. By 1942, the U-boats had grown bolder. They prowled up and down the American coast, sinking tankers within sight of the beaches. Flames lit the night sky from Florida to Newfoundland. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz smiled. England will bleed to death, he told his staff. And for a time it seemed he was right. Britain's reserves of grain oil and munitions fell to critical levels. Even Churchill began to whisper of the unthinkable. What if the lifeline broke entirely? But the Americans were only just beginning. New shipyards rose like cities overnight: Richmond, Portland, Baltimore. Conveyor lines replaced shipwright traditions. Men and women built ships the way they built automobiles: faster, simpler, interchangeable. A Liberty ship could be built in 30 days, some in less than 20. And with every launch, a new artery opened across the Atlantic. The lifeline was knitting itself back together. It wasn't glorious, it was mechanical, relentless, human. Still, in those early years, the outcome was uncertain. Every convoy was a coin toss. The radio silence, the sonar pings, the whispered prayers. "If we don't make it," one sailor said, "someone else will. And that's what matters." Their courage wasn't loud, it was stubborn. It was the quiet defiance of men who knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. Every ship they sailed carried not just cargo, but faith. Faith that an island could endure. Faith that an ocean could be beaten. And so the stage was set. The wolves had the numbers. The sea had the advantage. But the shipyards had fire and men who refused to rest. Britain was still standing, barely breathing, but standing. Behind her across the ocean, a nation of builders was rising. Sparks in the night, hammers in the dark, a heartbeat of steel against the deep. The next act of the war, the one Hitler never anticipated, was about to begin. And it would not be fought by admirals or generals, but by the hands that built ships faster than fear itself. It began with sparks, millions of them, dancing in the night like fireflies over the shipyards of America. The air smelled of oil, steel, and salt, the breath of a nation awakening from sleep. Along the coasts of California, Oregon, Virginia, and Maine, the skeletons of ships rose from empty docks, slow, clumsy, beautiful in their defiance. Men and women in overalls, faces streaked with sweat and soot, moved like clockwork, wielding torches, hammers, rivet guns. The symphony of war was not the roar of cannons, but the clang of steel upon steel. They called it the Liberty Program, a plan so vast it bordered on madness. The Maritime Commission promised thousands of cargo ships, simple, cheap, unglamorous, to replace every vessel the U-boats sent to the bottom. Each was 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, and capable of carrying nearly 10,000 tons of cargo. They were powered by a single triple-expansion steam engine, slow but reliable. At full speed, a Liberty ship could barely reach 11 knots slower than a submarine on the surface. But that didn't matter. The point wasn't speed. It was volume. The miracle lay not in design, but in production. Before 1941, building a cargo ship took 8 months, sometimes a year. Under Henry Kaiser's system, it took less than 40 days. Some yards broke their own records. One ship completed in just 4 days, 15 hours and 30 minutes. A feat so extraordinary it sounded like propaganda. But it was real. America had found its rhythm, the rhythm of mass production. The same heartbeat that built cars, trains, and skyscrapers was now building lifelines. Every shipyard became a small city shift, whistles, cafeteria bells, torchlight reflecting off the bay. Thousands poured in, welders, carpenters, pipe fitters, electricians, men too old to fight. Women who had never worked outside the home. Black and white side by side, though not always equal. They shared one truth: every ship they built meant lives saved across an ocean they would never see. They worked in silence and thunder. Sparks hissed against rain. The wind carried the smell of hot iron across the water. Radio stations played big band music between bulletins of new sinkings. Convoy HX-229 attacked heavy losses. No one stopped. They couldn't afford to. For every ship lost, another had to rise. The numbers told the story best. 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945, more than all other Allied merchant vessels combined. Together they carried over 75 million tons of cargo, from food to fuel tanks to planes, bombs to boots. Every 28 days, a new ship slid into the sea, christened with a bottle of cheap champagne, a prayer, and the same defiant words, "May she serve until victory." The Germans mocked them. Floating coffins, they sneered. Tin cans with engines. They weren't entirely wrong. The Liberty ships were crude, prone to cracks along their welded seams, weak in the cold Atlantic. Some broke in half mid-voyage, torn apart by stress and ice. But for every one that failed, 10 more took its place. They were never meant to be immortal, only numerous. The ocean could devour them by the dozen, but not by the thousand. In Washington, President Roosevelt called them the Bridge of Steel. He understood what they represented, not elegance, but endurance. Hitler had bet on fear. Roosevelt was betting on faith in industry, in people in the belief that ordinary work could defeat extraordinary evil. And it worked. Still, the scale was overwhelming. Each Liberty ship required 7,000 tons of steel, 5 miles of welding seams, 35,000 individual parts. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago fed the yards with a constant stream of metal and machinery. Trainloads of components rumbled night and day, boilers from Pennsylvania, propellers from New York, anchors from Alabama. It was a living network, a circulatory system of steel feeding a war effort too massive for one mind to comprehend. In Richmond, California, Kaiser's Yard employed 90,000 workers, a third of them women. They called them Rosies. They wore denim coveralls, tied their hair back with bandanas, and learned to weld faster than the men they replaced. Some could close a seam blindfolded. They worked under floodlights through the night, their faces glowing orange from the arcs of fire. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," one said later. "We were just trying to keep the world from sinking." The factories learned to breathe together. One yard built the hulls, another the engines, another the guns. Pieces were shipped, assembled, launched like a great machine, producing lifeboats for civilization itself. Each completed ship carried a name chosen by the people: the SS John Brown, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the SS Booker T. Washington, named after presidents, poets, inventors, soldiers, teachers. Some were named for heroes of color long ignored by history. For the first time, their names crossed the Atlantic engraved in steel, sailing toward freedom. Inside the ships, the crew quarters were cramped, bare cold. The engines were loud, the kind of sound that vibrated through bone. Every surface smelled of diesel and salt. The men aboard knew their odds. They were not soldiers, yet they faced death more often than most. They carried canned meat, powdered milk, munitions, trucks, aircraft fuselages, everything an army needed to survive. Some ships carried nothing but grain. Others tanks stacked like dominoes, engines wrapped in tarps, gasoline stored in drums, so volatile one spark could erase them all. In the logbooks, you can still read their signatures: captains, engineers, cooks, radio operators, each entry a heartbeat across time. Departed Baltimore. Weather calm. Radar functioning. Mid-Atlantic. Escort reports submarine activity. Lost contact with SS Westland, presumed sunk, and sometimes one final line: "God help us." But behind those dry words lay the unseen miracle that the convoys continued. Despite the danger, despite the losses the line held, the numbers began to shift. By mid-1943, the balance of tonnage had turned. The Allies were building ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. For the first time in the war, the curve bent upward, production outpacing destruction. The Lifeline was no longer bleeding out, it was pulsing again. Engineers called it the victory of logistics. Historians would later call it the triumph of democracy's muscle. But the men in the yards called it something simpler: work. Each rivet was a bullet. Each hull was a heartbeat. Each Liberty ship was a message across the Atlantic, a defiance in steel, a promise that Britain would not fall. They didn't know then that these ugly, boxy ships, dismissed by admirals, doubted by designers, would outlast the war. Some still sail today. Rusted, weathered, stubborn. The ghosts of their builders whisper through the wind as their hulls creak and sigh. Proof that in a world of machines built for death, one kind of machine was built to keep humanity alive. The Liberty ship was never a weapon, yet it won a war. And in the next act of this story, we'll step aboard one to meet the men who risked everything to keep her moving through hell itself. The Atlantic was a living thing that winter, a cold, breathing monster that swallowed light and sound. The sea rose like black glass beneath a sickle moon, and the wind carried salt that stung the skin raw. It was February 1943, the height of what sailors called the Black Pit, that endless stretch of ocean, where no aircraft could reach, where no radar could save you, where every hour might be your last. Convoy HX-229 had just entered it. 38 ships, slow, heavy, tired, bound from New York to Liverpool, each loaded to the brim with cargo meant to keep an island alive. The Liberty ship SS William Johnson was among them. One of the newest, her paint still smelling of the yard, her engines still untested by fear. Below deck, the air was thick with oil and sweat. The chief engineer wiped his face with a rag blackened by soot. The boilers hissed like serpents, and every vibration of the hull felt like a heartbeat. Above on the bridge, the captain stood in silence, a man of few words, his face carved by wind and war. He had crossed this ocean 11 times. He had seen men vanish, ships burn, and water swallow hope whole. Yet here he was again, staring into the dark horizon, listening for the sound every mariner feared most, the hollow metallic whisper of a torpedo cutting through the waves. The convoy moved at 8 knots, barely faster than a man could run. Each vessel followed the dim glow of the one ahead. The lights hooded the radios silent. Somewhere out there, invisible, patient, the wolves waited. German U-boats, dozens of them scattered like knives across the sea. Each crew knew the pattern. First came the sonar ping, a faint echo that sent chills through bone. Then the flash of light beneath the surface and the thunder. Midnight. The William Johnson's radio operator leaned close to his set. Static, faint, and endless. A whisper came through another ship, the SS Ringenwald, breaking silence. "We're hit port side, flames, then nothing but static again." On the bridge, the captain's knuckles turned white on the railing. He could see the glow on the horizon, a dull orange halo pulsing like a dying sun. The convoy didn't stop. Couldn't stop. That was the rule. Stop for one, lose them all. The men stood at their posts and said nothing. Only the engine spoke a low, steady groan as the ship pushed on through the dark. Hours passed. The sea rose higher. Ice formed along the railings. The men's faces were raw, their eyes hollow. Down in the galley, someone played a harmonica, soft, shaky, an old song from home. The cook stirred soup that no one would eat. One of the deckhands, barely 19, clutched a letter in his coat, his mother's handwriting fading in the damp. He whispered her name under his breath, though no one could hear it over the roar of the wind. These weren't soldiers. They had no medals, no glory. They were the thin line between survival and surrender, invisible heroes of a war fought in silence. At 03:17 a.m., the sonar blipped again. A flash, a strike. Not on them, but close. A column of water shot skyward behind the convoy. The ship hit was gone in seconds. The men didn't even see the hull break, only the aftermath, floating debris, the faint glow of burning oil, the echo of voices that faded too quickly. A few lifeboats bobbed in the swell, overturned. The Johnson's crew watched from the deck, helpless. "Should we turn back?" one asked. The captain shook his head. "We'd die too." His voice was flat, stripped of everything but duty. He turned away, his jaw, tight eyes fixed on the Black Sea ahead. By dawn, the convoy was scattered. Fog rolled in thick, merciless, and the radio filled with ghost signals. The William Johnson kept her course by compass alone. Somewhere behind her, ships burned quietly unseen. The sea was littered with oil slicks and drifting crates. Dead fish floated belly up, caught in the chemical sheen. The wind carried the smell of gasoline and salt, a smell that stuck to the skin, the clothes, the soul. One sailor on watch thought he saw something, a periscope's glint. He shouted, pointed, but before the words left his mouth, the deck exploded. A blast tore through the starboard side. Men were thrown against bulkheads, against steel, against flame. Alarms screamed. Steam hissed. The lights went out. The ship lurched hard to port her stern, dipping her bow, lifting as if gasping for air. The captain's voice cut through the chaos, calm, hoarse, deliberate. Seal the bulkheads. Keep her steady. Keep her moving. The engineer, bleeding from his arm, crawled back to the engine room and reignited the boiler by hand. The ship trembled, then steadied. She was still alive. For 30 minutes they fought the sea, patching holes, pumping water, dragging the wounded to the mess hall. One man died with his hand clutching the boiler lever. They covered him with a tarp and kept working. The William Johnson limped forward, smoke trailing her decks, slick with fuel. The convoy was gone. She was alone now. The black pit had swallowed everything else, but she refused to stop. At noon, a new sound cut through the wind, the drone of engines overhead. British patrol planes. They had reached the edge of air cover. For the first time in 3 days, the men cheered. They weren't safe, not yet, but they weren't forgotten either. The sea stretched endlessly around them, but the horizon no longer looked like a tomb. It looked like home. That night, the survivors gathered in the galley. The lights flickered. Someone passed around a bottle of cheap rum. They didn't toast victory, there was none to claim. They toasted the ship. To the Johnson, the captain said quietly. She held. The others nodded. No speeches. No songs. Just silence and the sound of the waves against the hull. Somewhere out there, more ships were still fighting their way through the dark. The men didn't know their names, but they felt them like ghosts moving alongside. Weeks later, when the William Johnson limped into Liverpool, her hull was twisted, her paint blistered, her decks scorched. But she was there. Crowds lined the docks, women, children, dock hands, waving, crying, shouting. The ship's crew could barely stand, but they waved back. One of the younger sailors looked at the crowd and whispered, "We brought them bread." That was enough. The Atlantic had not taken them. Not this time. Historians would later write about battles and generals' victories and losses, but the men who crossed the sea never called it that. They didn't think in terms of strategy or glory. To them, survival was victory. Every voyage completed was one more day the world didn't starve. They were merchants, not warriors, yet they carried the weight of empires on their backs. And though they returned with empty hands, they brought something no bullet could destroy, the proof that courage could exist without recognition, and that duty could survive even in the absence of hope. The Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful, but in those dark waters among fire and fear, she became something sacred. A temple of steel and sweat, a moving testament to human stubbornness, to the refusal to yield. The men who sailed her were not remembered in monuments or medals, but their silence became the foundation of victory. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, had become a bridge again, built not from stone, but from the will to endure. The William Johnson's log ends with one line written in the captain's hand, engines holding. Convoy scattered. Sea calm at last. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't poetry. It was life. And in that life, however fragile, however fleeting, Britain's heart kept beating. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had changed. It still rolled black and endless, Still swallowed ships whole, still whispered with the ghosts of convoys lost, but something deep beneath its surface had shifted. The wolves were no longer hunting freely. For the first time in 3 years, the hunters began to feel hunted. The silence that once favored them had turned into a trap of its own making. The British called it Black May. To the U-boat crews, it became something darker, Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. It began quietly, without warning. The convoys were no longer alone. On their flanks sailed new escorts, sleek, fast, bristling with radar and sonar. The Liberty ships, once floating coffins, were now guarded by destroyer escorts and corvettes, armed with the most advanced tools of detection ever sent to sea. The wolves could no longer approach unseen. Technology had caught up with terror. The Americans had built more than ships, they had built eyes. Aztec sonar, Huff-Duff direction finding, and the new Lee light, a blinding searchlight mounted under aircraft, turned the night into day. For the first time, U-boats that surfaced under cover of darkness found themselves bathed in light and then torn apart by machine guns and depth charges. The ocean was no longer safe for them even at night. The change came from a marriage of industry and intelligence. In Bletchley Park, mathematicians and cryptanalysts, the ghosts of war in tweed jackets, broke the German Enigma code. Every message between Admiral Donitz and his wolf packs began to bleed into Allied hands. Convoys could now change routes before ambushes slip through gaps in the blockade arrive home unseen. What had once been a blind ocean became a chessboard, and for the first time the Allies knew the next move. The numbers began to tell the story. In March 1943, 627 Allied ships were lost. By July, that number fell by half. By autumn, almost none. The hunter had become the hunted. U-boat commanders who once boasted of tonnage now wrote their final logs in panic. Depth charges continuous, hull buckling, surface impossible. Many never surfaced again. In 1 month alone, 41 submarines were sunk, entire crews vanished, their coordinates marked only by oil slicks and floating wreckage. The ocean, once Germany's greatest weapon, had turned on its master, and still the shipyards kept building. Liberty ships poured from the slips like waves themselves, unstoppable, unending. By 1944, one launched every 8 hours. No other industrial effort in history matched it. The same nation that once built automobiles now built freedom by the mile. The United States had become an ocean machine, a living organism of factories, railroads, forges, and furnaces. Hitler had predicted that democracy would crumble under the weight of war, but instead it had learned to mass-produce salvation. Even the Germans began to see it. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, wrote later in prison, "It was not the bombs that defeated us, it was the production. We were fighting a continent of steel." His words echoed the truth that numbers had become destiny. The Liberty ship, simple, slow, disposable, was never meant to be a marvel. Yet it embodied something more powerful than technology. It was proof that persistence could defeat precision. While the Reich perfected its Tigers and Messerschmitts, the Allies poured out engines by the thousands, ships by the hundreds, bullets by the millions. Quantity had become its own kind of genius, and with the tide turning at sea, the human balance shifted too. The merchant navy, once battered and forgotten, began to breathe again. Convoys arrived fuller, faster, more often. Grain shipments tripled. Fuel reserves stabilized. The ration lines in Britain shortened ever so slightly. Children who had grown up under blackout curtains saw the first fruits in years: oranges, coffee butter. It wasn't plenty, but it was life. The island that had nearly starved now pulsed again, with the rhythm of survival. In the control rooms of the Royal Navy, the mood had changed. The Admiralty's maps, once scarred by red pins marking losses, now showed green lines running clean from Halifax to Liverpool. Each green line meant a convoy that had made it through. Each meant hope. The sailors who once feared the horizon now looked upon it with pride. The sea, though still cruel, was no longer unbeatable. But it wasn't just machines and codes. It was the men who sailed who refused to stop. In the words of one survivor from the SS Ocean Vigil, we didn't think of winning. We just thought of arriving. That humble idea arrival became the symbol of victory. No grand speeches, no triumphal marches, just the steady rhythm of ships docking, cranes, unloading hands, working engines, roaring again. The sound of survival. Still, the wolves didn't vanish overnight. Some fought to the end. There were U-boats that refused surrender whose captains went down with their ships rather than face capture. There were convoys that never returned. The Atlantic took more than 70,000 lives before it was done. Sailors, civilians, engineers, gunners, swallowed whole by the same indifferent sea. But their deaths were not in vain. Each Liberty ship that reached port carried their memory in its hull, in every rivet, every weld, every scar from a near miss. The fleet had become a floating graveyard of courage. By 1944, the balance was irreversible. The Atlantic Lifeline had become a steel artery, unstoppable, self-repairing, eternal. The Allies were not just surviving, they were supplying. Convoys carried the lifeblood for something greater, Operation Overlord. Every ship that had once carried food now carried men and tanks bound for Normandy. The sea lanes that Hitler had tried to close became the highways of liberation. The very ocean that was meant to starve Britain now became the bridge by which Europe would be freed. From the ashes of fear, a new rhythm took hold, one of momentum, coordination, and inevitability. The German wolf packs that once stalked the Atlantic now hunted in desperation, scattered, starved of targets. They sank into the depths as the Liberty ships sailed past them, silhouettes against a dawn they could no longer stop. The war had shifted from survival to victory, and it all began not with heroes or soldiers, but with the hum of welders, the clang of iron, the relentless noise of men and women who refused to let the sea win. For every great war has its moment of turning a breath when despair breaks and endurance becomes destiny. For Britain, that moment came not on the beaches of Dunkirk or the skies of London, but here on the cold Atlantic, carried by 2,510 ships of steel and stubbornness, ships that didn't fight with guns, but with time. And as the waves began to calm and the losses slowed, the world realized something profound, that freedom like the sea cannot be starved forever. By the summer of 1944, the Atlantic no longer groaned with the same hunger. The waves that had once devoured ships now carried them hundreds at a time, gray hulls lined across the horizon like an iron bridge between continents. Convoys that once sailed in fear now moved in rhythm, a floating city of smoke radar masts and steel hearts beating in unison. The sea hadn't grown gentler, it never does, but the men upon it had learned its language. They no longer whispered prayers before every dawn. They spoke with confidence. They had outlasted the dark. It was victory not in the blinding flash of battle, but in the quiet persistence of supply. Bread on British tables, coal in factory furnaces, fuel in Spitfires streaking across the channel. The Liberty ships had done what armies could not, they had kept a nation breathing. Churchill called it the miracle of the shipyards, and he wasn't wrong. For every ton of cargo that reached Liverpool or Bristol, there was a man or woman who had built, sailed, or died for it. Freedom had a factory stamp. Victory had a rivet's echo. In Normandy, the echoes of that industrial heartbeat landed on the beaches. The invasion Operation Overlord was not a miracle of generals, but of logistics. Over 6,000 vessels crossed the Channel that June, many of them Liberty ships. They carried tanks, trucks, rations, munitions, everything that turned sand into victory. The same hulls that had braved the wolves now faced artillery and mines unloading under fire. Their decks shook, their cranes twisted, their crews worked until their hands bled, and when one ship went down, another took its place before the smoke cleared. The tide of men and machines didn't stop. It couldn't. Behind every soldier storming the beaches stood a ship that had delivered him there. In Berlin, the nightmare had reversed. The reports that once celebrated tonnage sunk now spoke of collapse. U-boat bases were silent. Factories were bombed. Crews refused missions. Admiral Dönitz, once confident, wrote in despair, "The Atlantic is lost. For every submarine that slipped beneath the waves, 2 more were destroyed before they ever left port. The wolves were dying in their own lairs. The sea that had once been Germany's weapon had become its grave. But beyond the numbers, beyond the grand maps of war rooms and operations, there were smaller stories. Stories that history seldom tells. The welder in Richmond who never left the factory, she built 32 ships and saw her son return on the 32nd. The cook aboard a Liberty ship who turned salt water into soup for men too cold to taste it. The radio operator who kept speaking into silence long after his convoy was gone because he refused to believe he was the last one alive. These were the quiet heroes, no medals, no speeches, only endurance, only duty. When the war finally began to end, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. In May 1945, as the flags rose again over London and the bells tolled across Europe, the Liberty Fleet was still moving, still carrying food, still bringing soldiers home, still crossing a sea now littered with wrecks and rust. In their logbooks, one could read the last lines of a global effort written not in glory but in labor. Arrived Liverpool, cargo intact, crew accounted for, no parades, just the sound of boots on steel decks and the sigh of engines cooling in the dawn. The shipyards that had once roared with fire grew silent. The torches went cold. The cranes froze in place. Men who had worked without pause for 4 years stood by the water and listened to the quiet. For the first time in memory, there was nothing left to build. They looked at the sea at the horizon filled with ships and realized what they had done. They had forged more than steel. They had built the endurance of an entire world. In the aftermath, many Liberty ships were sold for scrap. Others were left to rust in harbors forgotten. Some were converted into peacetime carriers hauling grain coal or emigrants to new lives across oceans. A few survived storms, fires, collisions too stubborn to die. And some, the lucky ones, were saved, preserved in ports as floating museums. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the SS John W. Brown, still alive, still creaking, still whispering stories through the smell of oil and salt. You can walk their decks today, touch the cold steel, hear the echo of engines that once carried the weight of history. But the true legacy of those ships isn't in museums, it's in memory. Every Liberty ship carried a name, thousands of them. Presidents, poets, engineers, ordinary citizens. Each name meant someone who had contributed, someone whose life became part of the bridge across the sea. And in that way, they became something larger than steel. They became a story of people united not by fear, but by work, by the simple, stubborn belief that together they could outbuild death itself. In 1943, before the tide had turned, a British sailor wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting the Germans. We are fighting the sea." And in a way he was right. For the sea is the oldest enemy, indifferent, eternal, undefeated. But for a moment in history, humanity stood against it and refused to sink. The Liberty ships were the proof, crude, loud, fragile, yet somehow immortal. Their decks carried not just cargo, but faith, the faith that civilization could survive its darkest night. When Hitler's empire crumbled, when the war ended in fire and silence, there was one image that captured it all: a Liberty ship entering the Thames at sunrise. Her paint peeling her crew, gaunt, her hull riddled with shrapnel. And yet she sailed straight and steady, her flag fluttering weakly in the morning wind. The city that had nearly starved watched her glide past her hold filled with food, her decks lined with men who had crossed the abyss and returned. In that moment, London's heart began to beat again. History remembers the great battles, Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, but the Battle of the Atlantic was the one that made all the others possible. Without those convoys, without those builders, without those 710 Liberty ships, there would have been no invasion, no liberation, no dawn. The war would have ended not in victory, but in silence. And perhaps that's the greatest truth of all, that salvation doesn't always arrive in glory. Sometimes it comes slow and clumsy, rusted and loud, floating on the backs of those who never sought recognition. By the end of 1945, Britain's docks overflowed with ships, their holds bursting with life. Fruit, sugar, tea, coal, timber. The same docks that had once fallen silent beneath bombs now thundered again, with cranes, engines, laughter. The sea had given back what it had taken. The Liberty fleet had not just carried cargo, it had carried civilization itself. A floating promise that endurance, when shared by many, can rewrite the fate of nations. And as the years faded and the ships rusted into the horizon, the old mariners told their stories quietly, in pubs, in shipyards, in the corners of fading photographs. One of them said, "We didn't win the war. We just kept it alive long enough for victory to find us." His voice cracked as he said it. Then he smiled. That's enough. The Liberty ship was never built to last forever, but its story did. Because somewhere beneath the sound of the wind and the surf, you can still hear it, that low, steady hum of engines, the sound of a world that refused to sink. The war ended, but the sea did not rest. Even in peace, it kept its secrets cold, silent, heavy. Beneath its shifting skin lay the bones of ships that never made it home, the echoes of engines that once roared for freedom, the final whispers of men who vanished into black water and foam. The Atlantic had taken much, but it had also given back something far greater. It had given the world proof that endurance can be louder than violence. Today, if you stand on a windy dock, maybe in Liverpool or Halifax or Portland, and close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The hum of distant engines, the clang of hammers from vanished shipyards, the murmur of sailors laughing through their fear. The sea remembers. It always does. Somewhere out on that endless gray horizon, a Liberty ship still floats not in body but in spirit. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, still alive in San Francisco Bay, her decks restored, her hull humming with the heartbeat of memory. Walk her corridors and you'll feel it, the ghosts of the men who built her, the women who welded her seams, the radio operators who whispered into static and prayed for dawn. The scent of oil and salt hasn't faded. The steel still trembles when the wind hits her right. She breathes even now. The Liberty fleet was never meant to last forever, but it did. Not as iron, not as industry, but as legacy. Each ship was a sentence in the long story of human persistence. Together, they became a chapter one written not in glory, but in grit. They taught the world that sometimes salvation doesn't arrive in a single heroic act. It comes slowly, one ship at a time. One voyage, one weld, one storm survived. In the end, Hitler's empire fell not to bombs or bullets, but to the quiet defiance of hands that refused to stop working. The weapon he could not defeat was the will to build again and again and again. The Liberty ships weren't beautiful, they weren't perfect, but they were enough. And in war sometimes enough is the difference between darkness and dawn. As the decades passed, the sea swallowed the wrecks and smoothed their scars. But in every wave that breaks against the cliffs of Britain, in every whistle of wind over empty docks, there lingers a rhythm, the same heartbeat that once pulsed through 1,000 engines, a rhythm made not of power, but of persistence. Some lessons, Churchill once said, are written in smoke and steel, others in silence. This was one of them. The silence after battle. The silence of ships unloading at midnight. The silence of men who came home and never spoke of what they'd seen because they didn't need to. The sea had already said it for them. Look at the photographs, grainy, faded, timeless. Faces half lit by welding sparks, arms streaked with grease, eyes squinting through fog. None of them imagined they were building history. They were just trying to build one more ship before the tide came in. Yet together, they built the bridge that saved the world. The Liberty Fleet was more than steel. It was the sound of democracy learning to move. The shape of hope welded into hulls, the quiet miracle that kept Britain alive long enough to fight back and to win. Every crate of food unloaded, every child fed, every light turned back on after years of blackout. All of it began with the hum of those engines crossing the Atlantic through darkness. And maybe that's the final truth, that history isn't always written by victors, but by survivors, by those who endure the cold, who keep the fire burning when the world freezes over. The Liberty ships carried no heroes, only ordinary people doing impossible things. And yet in the end, that's all history ever needed. So the next time you hear the sound of distant waves, pause. Listen. Somewhere beneath that rhythm is the heartbeat of 710 ships that refuse to die quietly. The sea hums their names still. John Brown, Booker T. Washington, William Johnson, Jeremiah O'Brien. Thousands of echoes rusted but unbroken. Together they form a chorus, low, steady, eternal. The ocean doesn't remember victories. It remembers voices. The cries in the dark. The laughter after survival. The clang of steel against steel. And when the wind rises and the waves roll against the docks, it almost sounds like applause, faint, distant, endless, for the men and women who built the bridge that kept the light alive. Because in the end, the Liberty Fleet was never just about ships. It was about what they carried not in their holds, but in their purpose. Hope, work, defiance. The belief that no sea, no enemy, no darkness could outlast the will of free people to build, to endure, to keep going. The war faded, the world moved on, but the lesson remained. Sometimes victory doesn't march, it sails. And sometimes salvation doesn't shout. It hums softly, like an engine somewhere over the horizon, still pushing forward, still keeping the lifeline alive.